Hey, this is David Lee Kim, co founder of Omniscient Digital, and you're listening to The Long Game. In this episode, we chat with Eric Hann, the Senior Director of Marketing at Order, a software company that helps businesses spend more efficiently. Eric has a wide ranging background after spending time at companies like Mainstay, HubSpot, PayPal, and Liberty Mutual. He's an expert on helping early stage technology companies find go to market fit. Eric and I go way back to our days at HubSpot, and I'm fortunate to call him a friend, so you'll hear some of that in this conversation. And we talk about how he found his sweet spot with his skill set and what types of companies he thrives in. He shares how he thinks about building a demand generation team and program from scratch, twice now, and we get into the idea of career sampling and how he's thought about building his career and skill set. He also has a pretty hot take on process at the end of our conversation. This was a really fun one. I think you'll learn a lot. Here's my conversation with Eric Hann. Eric, my friend, how are you doing, man? Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us for the long game.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, this is exciting. I know we've been talking about doing a podcast together, and this has been a long time in the making. You've been a busy guy, so I'm glad we could finally make this time. You've just been grinding and building the business.
It's been a whirlwind. Last 6 months have been a lot of fun over at Order, just getting things going.
Yeah, so you're currently Senior Director of Marketing at Order.
Yep.
And you previously had stints at companies like Mainstay, HubSpot, PayPal, and a curveball here is Liberty Mutual.
Yeah.
Tell us about that career trajectory and that journey to where you are today.
Totally. Yeah, it's pretty funny because if I at the time, it all made sense. But if you look at it on paper, you're like, what did you do? I did marketing undergrad, and I was just like, having really strong quantitative data skills is going to be really important. I knew that. So, and that was something I didn't have a ton of in my undergrad. So, started my career for a couple of years actually as an analyst at Liberty, which gave me, I think, a pretty good skill set just in terms of like how I think about problem solving. That took that into a process improvement role where I was going to different departments at Liberty to help them deploy lean methodologies. This is a good introduction to coaching and how to look for efficiencies, most organizations are pretty good at optimizing for their work streams, but tend to struggle if they're optimizing across each other's work streams. So a lot of the thesis of that role was helping businesses understand how they fit into the bigger picture and like took away the pain points in between them. I think I've taken that to, all my future roles. But quickly learned that startups and technology were where I was most passionate. So moved my career there quickly. Definitely learned the most at HubSpot to kind of move me in that direction in terms of, falling in love with small businesses and the technology space.
Got it. And so you didn't start in marketing. How did you make that transition into marketing?
Yeah, it's a cool question. So at the time, HubSpot was just really getting cruising with their new hubs. So they had Marketing Hub, but Sales Hub and, services were starting to become important in like really big product lines. And they were looking for somebody who could help kind of bridge that gap in cross-selling, just to help kind of drive those competencies. And they needed someone who had some analyst background, some marketing experience, some coaching experience to potentially like figure out, using product telemetry data, where are there opportunities to have cross-sell, upsell, how is their sales enablement and training that can potentially teach that new motion? How can you target really strong customer marketing campaigns based on what you can see in the data? So it was a good combination of my skills. And at the time, I really wanted to get back to marketing. So it was a really great fit. Thankful for my time there.
Yeah. Yeah. We met when we were at HubSpot, and I remember you had a bunch of different titles since then. So I'm looking at your LinkedIn, you were like marketing manager for global cross-sell, upsell enablement.
Yeah.
Like you did customer content, and then at Mainstay you did like product marketing, go-to-market strategist, growth marketing.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about this idea of like a zone of genius where you just find that sweet spot of like where you really fit and your skills and background and interests fit really well.
Mm.
Tell me about like, have you feel like you found that sweet spot in what you're doing in your career and what you're working on?
Yeah, I think it took me a decade, but I think, well, so I'll start with like, I guess my passions, interests. I believe that progress happens best when you can combine it with what's pragmatically feasible. And startups is one of the best mechanisms to do that, and venture capital, because you essentially take an idea that improves the world. You need it to improve the world enough so that you're able to articulate it in a way that drives a change response in the market just by literally buying and implementing whatever that thing is. And it requires you to do it in a way that's economically feasible. So that's something that can innately just kind of enter the world. And if you're really successful in doing that, you either force the status quo to change to adopt your model. Like think about how Uber and Netflix just did that, right? Or you get acquired. And I think startups are a really cool place to work because it does drive that progress. And you can stand to gain a lot by doing it, right? It's the right incentive to have people do that kind of problem solving, challenging work. So I'll always see myself, I think, in this universe, like early stage companies through, just finding go to market fit. And I think what I really like to do is kind of take the analytical approach to creativity to figure out like, there's no playbook that just works for everybody. So you need the mechanism to adapt things that tend to work to whatever scenario you're in. And I really enjoy the problem solving that requires, and building the teams that can kind of enable it.
Yeah, I know. Just knowing you personally, I know like you're a big fan of Legos and building. True. I know you built like a huge Lego village. Maybe that's something you can talk about.
We could talk Quarantine if we want. That's deep pandemic. That's April. This isn't going to be over anytime soon.
Yeah, it was like you needed an outlet because you're just naturally a builder. And when I think of kind of two buckets people fall into is like, I mean, it's not super clear lines, but I've noticed there's a pattern of people who like the building stage of lots of ambiguity, 0 to 1, and there's kind of the optimizers. Like, great, it's proven. Let me figure out how to make it better. It sounds like you thrive in that 0 to 1 stage. Is that right?
Yeah, I really like the building phase.
Where does that come from? Like, did you have any, like, do you feel like you have any childhood experiences that led you down that path versus the other path?
So this is actually pretty funny. So my mom is a behavioral analyst. And as a kid, I lacked what you would call executive function. That's a scientific term that I don't know a lot about. But I do know that Legos is one of the things you can do to get better at it, because it basically takes large, overwhelming tasks and breaks it down into steps. So like when kids are playing with toys like Legos, you start to build that mechanism that, oh, it's actually not that hard to build this cool pirate ship. It's actually just a series of steps. And if you can break down something difficult into a series of steps, then you can get better at executive function. So I think it worked. I like to hope so, at least. But yeah, it's the passion stuck. I think it's really fun to build that kind of thing. I like woodworking too for the same reason. It's just like making stuff.
Yeah. I feel like that's a great lesson for professionals too, where you've probably had experiences working with people where they have this huge vision or end point that they want to get to with the program, but because it seems so big and nebulous, it's kind of like paralyzing. Whereas for you, it sounds like you take it and you're like, well, what's the first step to do this?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because like when you're at a startup, usually the fear isn't I'm going to break something. Right. Like, so it kind of automatically, just by nature of being the first to build something, it really engenders like the mindset that it's okay if I fail, because that's the only way I can turn it into something that's valuable. And sure, for a company, but also like marketing programs. So like, if you're coming into a really established company and you might be worried, oh, if I send a bad email, it's going to be the end of the world. And there probably is real revenue trade-offs at a large company if that happens. But at a startup, like you don't have an audience yet. So you got to figure out how to build one. So therefore you can do stuff that, is a little bit more Wild West. As long as you're disciplined and measuring and thoughtful in your hypotheses, it actually starts to work.
Yeah. So let's get into some of the building that you've done, and let me know if I don't have my facts straight. My understanding is you had a big part of building the marketing function at Mainstay and Order. I think from scratch almost. Tell us about those experiences of like building those teams and those programs.
Yeah, totally. All our group efforts. So I'll start with that, but I definitely feel like I had a large role in both. So with Mainstay, super interesting. I was hired to do product marketing, and that was a big part of it. But I think quickly we realized there was a lot of opportunities to build traditional demand functions. So I quickly kind of took a hybrid role where I was helping with that while also doing kind of some positioning work and product launch work. It's a fun challenge when you're entering a business to try and figure out how to structure a marketing team, because a lot of times you need to just make some bets. And most of those times you don't have sufficient data to make those bets. So it's a unique challenge. It's definitely something where if there are people who really crave certainty at work, it's probably not for them. But there's things you can do on purpose to kind of get direction while you're doing that. Part of it is, what are the unique capabilities of the startup that I can amplify, right? Because, a lot of marketers think a ton about how do I build an audience, right? Like whether it's an inbound audience or a paid audience or some sort of content audience like this podcast, right? It's, you have to decide. So, a good place to start is, what is my business already really good at? What teams exist that I can amplify? What data do we have? What insight do we have? What unique perspective do we have? And that's a good place to start. And then you can start to test those with different formats, different channels. I will say one thing that's interesting about the startup space is you have a very real need to support the sales team while you're doing it. So you can never be 100% in speculative and marketing tactics. You need to be somewhat grounded in what's repeatable, and that usually costs a lot. So often you'll find you need either an agency or an in-house expert to have some sort of paid mechanism that gives you the lead runway to start testing all these other speculative things as a balance. So that's what we did in different forms at Mainstay and now at Order. It's how do you build an engine that can supply what you'd expect from the sales funnel, just in terms of hitting your real demand goals, while also starting to branch out into these other things to see where you can build an audience. Yeah.
So I see like it's going to be one question, but for two different scenarios. So take it as you will. So I see two scenarios here where there's one is building a demand gen program from scratch. Like, where do you start? And then for maybe later stage companies who already have some sort of demand programs, like, well, we have to diversify and like add another channel. Where do we start? So how do you go about like going to the specifics or even tactics of like, what's that process of validating those channels, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, totally. So I think the first thing is you have to feel like you have to learn what are the rules of the game, and they're different at every company. And those rules are usually dictated by your model and your LTV to CAC and how expensive your product is and your conversion metrics. So like basically one of the first things to do if you're trying to figure out how to spend money to drive demand, in my opinion, should be you find out how much can I actually spend for a conversion, and how do I know I can spend it, and how do I know as a cohort if that's good spend or not, or efficient spend or not. And that's going to be different depending on where you work. If your software costs $1,000 or $10,000, that changes a lot. If you can target a large audience or very specific niche, then that also changes a lot. So I think there's like a calibration phase of how well do we understand our ICP? What kind of unit economics do we need to play within, just to get like literally lines on the field, to use another sports analogy. Not that I really watch sports or play sports, but people say those things. And then from there, you can start testing things that you have a attacking point. So you can go see like, hey, if I'm going to 0 to 1 on paid search, which is an obvious place for a lot of people to start because it's such a high intent channel, right? Can I get to that magic quadrant of, yes, this is the right person at a cost I can take based on like the cohort. And it usually also requires really tight alignment with your sales team because you don't have a lot of wiggle room if you are passing the right people through, but for some reason the rotation isn't strong or the enablement isn't strong. So like making sure that commitment exists and that enablement mechanism exists is really important to doing that test, because you don't want to get a cohort of people and have it fail because like the team wasn't ready for it. So I think part of it's that making sure the funnel is equipped to handle what you're bringing. Second is having rules of the road for how you're actually testing them. And third is you have to make some hypotheses as to where your ICP is likely at and how effectively can you reach them there. At Mainstay, we had a unique challenge of, reaching higher ed and decision makers at higher ed. There's not that many of them. I mean, there's a lot, but not compared to like a B2B channel. So, a channel like paid search, which is high intent, is just inherently limited because there's only some people searching for that technology. So you can use it to a point, but then it just has a diminishing return. So you have to be, when you're doing planning for growth, you have to be able to be kind of clear-eyed about, how much bottoms up can I expect and how much improvement can I model? Like, I would say it's tempting to drag the spreadsheet, so to speak, but you need to be really confident that like the specific pieces of that demand program being built over time are actually achievable.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that. Like, you need to know the rules of the game. Like, if you're an enterprise software company targeting Fortune 500, you shouldn't be trying to optimize for the most organic traffic because one, you're probably not going to reach the right people, and two, there's probably not that much search traffic among that audience. So why is that the goal? And I've seen a lot of companies have those initiatives where they're like, hey, we're going to do these 3 things, but you might, once you dig a little bit deeper, it's like, wait, do those actually like, should we be optimizing for that? Are those the right metrics? And then all of a sudden, like you kind of find that immediate flaw in the strategy because it's actually just a list of tactics without strategy behind it.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah. So
do you agree with that? Is that something that, I mean, you're building a business right now. How does that feel kind of based on how you guys are approaching it?
Yeah. So when we target like B2B software companies, that's who we want to work with. That's what our background and like unique value prop is in. And because we come from experimentation backgrounds, like in growth, we work off of hypotheses, and like, we're not going to have a lot of data to support it, but we should have some assumption and some reason to believe that it's true. Yeah. And so like, even this podcast was one example. Like, we believe that if we can interview really smart people who like might like chatting with us, that maybe they'll like refer people to us or like want to work with us. That's not the primary goal. Like, we just want to talk to smart people and like learn. But it ended up being true. Like, some folks have actually been like, hey, actually, we're looking for an SEO and content agency. Like, maybe we can work together. Or they'll be like, hey, you guys clearly know what you're doing. Like, I have someone that actually needs your help. Can I refer them? And so those hypotheses might have taken a year or 2 to prove out. But looking back, we can say, yep, we had strong reasons to believe in these assumptions and they've played out. So for us, it was a little bit challenging. Not everyone has 2 years of runway to test out a hypothesis, but we were sort of like, we really believe in this with a lot of conviction. So we just committed.
That's awesome. You made me think another important variable in the game, which is how fast your sales cycle is, because that really impacts how quickly you can learn and in what channels. So, I have a lot of empathy for marketers where there's a really long sales cycle and they're trying to figure out what channels are the ones that are the difference makers. That's one thing I really like about Order. That sales turnaround is very fast. So we're able to run at a pretty quick clip just from a learning standpoint.
Yeah. Have there been any experiments or hypotheses you've tested in building these demand gen programs where you're like, you know what, this might not work and that's okay, but it ended up working? Any stories you can share?
I have a good one at Mainstay. So shout out Kevin Swecker. He kind of ran this program. But we had this kind of theory where, our ICP really likes to philosophize. And right, we're talking about high level college academics. So we had this hypothesis. It's like, well, what if we just all invited them to a virtual dinner and like see what happens? And it actually started working over time. Like, credit to Kevin, because he really iterated on it a lot. But as it went, like, we got it to a pretty strong place where it's like we had this group of people who would want to convene and talk about a specific problem. And like, we didn't even really introduce any sales or marketing language at all. It was very much just we became the host to allow this group forum. But then we used that to inform another content loop, which was we can kind of round up these conversations as an asset. Like, hey, we talked to a whole bunch of people in the space, and these are the minutes. And, it was a really strong content offer for the people in that community, because who wouldn't want to go hear from 100 other people that are solving similar problems? Like, I think about myself for that. Like, anyone who's able to round up insights from a bunch of marketing leaders is always really interesting. And that just didn't exist yet in college admissions. So yeah, that worked pretty well. And I think we had an inkling that it would work, but I don't think we had, it wasn't a surefire bet, but I think it paid off.
Yeah.
Then with Order, I think a lot of the things that have been working were, I don't want to say they were like pretty standard plays, but this is one of the folks on my team, Mark, who runs all of these programs, has got paid to a place where like really strong unit economics. And, huge shout out to you guys for helping us with organic, right? That's gotten to a place where we finally have a first audience to convert. So I would say nothing super surprising yet at Order, but just making sure that we have the ABCs right and kind of modifying them to our current business landscape, and riffing on them. Like, one of the things we're testing right now is just basically a mid-funnel group demo opportunity for nurturing. Like, we don't have that. Right? Yeah, it's going to be like 7 to 10 minutes of content plus a very quick overview. And our hypothesis is there are a lot of people who want to explore a software but don't want to get put in a sales funnel, because every company has trained the world that request a demo means you're in a sequence. So we're going to see, hey, if we just let you come and check it out, will that effectively drive those people who might not otherwise enter a sales funnel to want to, just actually having seen the value?
Yeah. What's the framing for that? Because even when I hear group demo, I'm like, I'm still going to get hit by a sales rep. It's just, I'm going to be one of many, and I know who else is going to get hit by a sales rep. So do you explicitly say like, hey, like this isn't a sale, or like you're not going to get put in a sequence, or what?
Yeah, we the reps who are kind of promoting it are using it as a, hey, if you're just interested to learn more, you can check us out. We do these for folks as an informational session. Mm-hmm. A lot of the promotion will be from our SDR team for folks who are like, yeah, I'm interested, but we don't need to buy anything right now. But we'll see if it works. They could very well be what you said, which is folks are like, yeah, I see right through this and no, thank you.
Yeah. Like you kind of see it as internally, you're viewing it as pre-sales though. It's like, hey, you're not ready to talk to sales. This is sort of salesy, but like, we're not going to hard pitch you or anything. Just learn about the product with like no strings attached. Yeah. That's interesting.
Now, the tricky thing is we may be adding a funnel stage. And if we're doing that, then that certainly would not be as good as just getting some percentage of them to talk to sales in the first place. So we have to be really careful about who we promote it to.
Yeah, it's going to make your conversion rate seem low. that group demo stage to what actual opportunity might seem very low.
Yep.
I wanted to go back to those forums you mentioned that you started putting together. It sounds in line with some of these community efforts I've been seeing companies do, like, hey, we're the community for talking about, I don't know, I was in product-led growth. So like product-led growth, if you're a growth practitioner, join this community. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like those forums either were kind of smaller groups, and that content loop you mentioned was genius, because I imagine that became like a gated offer.
Yes.
where a dean of a university can go download it and you can email them like, hey, would you like to join the next forum? And that finishes the loop there. That's really cool. I'm curious, how did you start those forums? Like, I think you said it was his name Kevin that started the program.
Yep.
Like, did he just email a bunch of people like, hey, are you interested in this thing?
Yeah, well, it was a group effort. So at Mainstay, we have one of the co-founders, Kirk, was or still is their kind of evangelist, is very tied into higher ed in general, and Ben is the team leader there or the marketing leader there, and they had or still do a PR group that was also really tied in, called Whiteboard Advisors to Higher Ed. So the first few pilots came from that kind of group effort of like, hey, let's get a good keynote and build it around that. But then, it's easy to take and run from there with other contacts in the database. Like and the thing about people who go to these is a lot of them wanted to come back and maybe be a speaker. So you can kind of use that to get some momentum, and then you can use that kind of name brand to start building the audience. I think one of the benefits of when we launched this was that it was the pandemic. So everybody, probably was over leveraged on Zoom meetings. This was early pandemic when we started. So Zoom fatigue hadn't yet set in as much. And people were like, oh, an opportunity to socialize with peers. I don't really have that anymore. So I think there was some latent
I see.
Yeah.
Got it.
And I could see something very similar now that we're serving, at Order, we're serving operations and finance people, right? Mm-hmm. I could see some version of that community of practice being really strong too. So we're figuring out different ways to do that. Really excited about an upcoming event we have in September with a group called Executive Council, where we're going to do a similar play, and our guest speaker is the Office of the CFO for the NBA. So that'll be a pretty cool driver for, cool. If you're in New York and you're in finance, like that seems like a pretty cool dinner to go to. So pumped to see how that goes.
Are you going to get a seat at the table?
That's a question. We're being pretty specific about like who goes in terms of like not kind of flooding the room, but there's a possibility.
Yeah, that just sounds like it'll be a cool conversation.
I know. Yeah, I'll probably go to one of them. Maybe not the first one. We'll see.
Yeah. So let's step out of this rabbit hole of like demand gen program and some of the programs you've run, and take a step back and talk about how you built these teams. I know when we were at HubSpot, we were both individual contributors. Like since then, we've both gone through quite a lot of transitions at multiple companies, and you've built multiple teams now. So what have you learned about building effective teams?
Yeah. So I can speak specifically to this stage because I think most of my experience is centered in that kind of stage we talked about earlier of early phase startups. I think there's a few things that I think are really required for success. The first one is an innate curiosity. Like it's if you're in a world where you're building and iterating by definition, people who have an innate sense of curiosity, who are going to ask like 10 levels down worth of questions to figure it out. And like, I would say there are people who are oriented to searching for root cause. Like those people do really well because like each step will require that to get it to a place where all of a sudden you're like, yeah, we should do this as much as we possibly can. And like, I think a lot about like the life cycle of a channel or a tactic as like the first step is this even predictable? Like if we do it, can we tell you how much will happen? And then once you have predictability, then the next thing is like, can we do it again? And then if you have repeatability, then you can start to be like, okay, how do I optimize and scale? And in order to get through that life cycle, you need someone who just innately, regardless of marketing background or anything else, can seek where things fell short and why. And
how do you filter for that trait?
It's hard. One is what questions they ask me in interviews. I put a really strong bias on that. Like there are folks that you can tell in an interview that seek understanding based on what you said versus just like ask a question and they go, okay. and then move on to the next question on their list. And I feel bad because some people are just kind of nervous on their feet. So maybe we're screening people inappropriately with that sense. But that's not true. One person that did a really great job, like they didn't have good questions on their call, but then they sent an email afterwards, like having processed it.
Yeah.
And that's a good way to see, like, still curious, but more of a processor than a, real-time conversation person. So that's one way. Another is you can ask questions like, what have you learned recently? One from HubSpot that I always loved is, what's something that you're an expert in, or in a room of 1,000, what's something you're the best at? Because people who have a mechanism to get really good at something understand that it by nature takes failure and iteration.
I'm taking notes on those. Yeah, I think on the questions piece, I don't want to poke fun at it, but what's very cringe is when a candidate doesn't have any questions.
Oh, it's awful.
And I'm just like, none at all. Not like, not even generic, like, what's the founding story or anything like that? Just say something. But I'm like, oh man, why did you even take this interview if you don't have any questions or any curiosity?
It's so bad, but that's my feeling. If I have a candidate and I ask them, do you have any questions? They say no. I think, well, that was a waste of my time. There's half an hour I won't get back. That's like my very first feeling if they say.
Yeah, I felt kind of like an asshole for feeling that way, but I was like, it's probably a good thing I have that feeling, because that tells me I probably don't want to work with this person and they probably won't be a good fit for the company and what we need. All right, so innate curiosity. Go ahead.
I was going to say one thing to screen for is you'll get a sense for people who think they know exactly what they're going to do. And the interview is much more about like, I have a plan. That's your golden ticket. And then you're like, you don't know anything about us yet. So that's kind of a red flag, because they're kind of showing you that they have a thing that they do no matter what. And like new information doesn't change their approach. So if there's questions you can get to screen for, if I give you more information, do you rethink what you're talking about? That's another pretty good indicator.
Oh, interesting. So how does that manifest? Like what's an actual example of how you do that?
Yeah. Like, so sometimes I'll ask folks to tell me about a campaign that they're really proud of, or a tactic they're really proud of. And then I'll ask, like, what did you learn and how did that change what you did next? And usually people will give you like a pretty good story if they have one. And if they don't, you might think, oh, they weren't holding the thread or paying attention.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. One of the things that I've found is ask about like maybe their campaign that they ran, and then dig deeper. Like, tell me about what parts of it were like tell me about a challenging part of that and how you got around it. Then it's digging into the weeds, and you can actually tell who's kind of BSing, like, and taking credit for something they didn't actually have a big part in, which it gets really uncomfortable, because I'm like, well, which direction do I take this conversation now? But yeah, digging 2 or 3 layers deeper to responses has been a key part of finding some of these traits, for me at least.
100%.
So you mentioned innate curiosity.
That's a good one.
That's something you filter for. How else do you think about building effective teams?
Yep. This one's pretty widely, I think, accepted, but people who are comfortable being generalists tends to do well at startups, because they can kind of float and they're comfortable with, I would say, shifting responsibilities. And, a month in a startup feels like a quarter in other places. And that usually just means that the nature of your work might change a lot as you start to build those things. So people who are just excited to just try new things in general, and like, let's say repetition might not be the most exciting thing for them, and they'd rather have the opportunity to try a lot of things and maybe have already done that successfully, they do well. And if that generalist also is an expert at something important, then they do very well. So if there's someone who can say like, hey, firmly, I am world-class at this, and I also like to try my hand on a lot of things with like well-rounded skill sets, that's who you want to stack your team on in a startup, because it gives you both bedrock to build programs with adaptability if the business requires it.
That's personally interesting for me, and I'm curious if you this resonates with you. I've always been a generalist. Like I have some specialty skills, but mostly I'm a generalist. And I used to feel kind of crappy about that because everyone was always talking about specialization until I realized, wait, generalists are needed, are totally necessary, especially like we hear it in this conversation now. Is that something you ran into personally? Because you strike me as quite a generalist as well.
Yeah, I definitely identify as one. Well, what's interesting is it depends on what level. It's hard to be a generalist entry level, which just sucks. So if you're someone who's like in an entry level job, it's likely that you need to specialize to move up the ladder. But then what's the catch-22 is deep specialists tend to struggle as they get higher than that because it requires things that they might not have seen. So like when I give career advice to people, I suggest that they kind of balance situations where they're building their skill sets versus there might be broadly applying them in ways that they haven't before or seeing them executed in a way that's different. And I think that tends to work. Like if you kind of tend to pendulum between like companies that have excellence in this area and you're learning from people who really know how to do it, and then companies where you need to build things from scratch, because if you're learning from others, you kind of can be a sponge. And when you have to go apply it, that usually forces you to build more well-rounded skill sets around it because you don't have the infrastructure to do it for you. So like if you're wondering early career people like who maybe identify as a generalist, I wouldn't be afraid to specialize. Just know that you can go build your own rotational program and get a few specializations. And all of a sudden you're a generalist that's really strong. So, and the other thing, this is something that Kip said a lot about at HubSpot is like marketing really centralized to channels right now in terms of there's only so many. So that tends to engender really deep specialists being highly sought after. In a leadership standpoint, you then have the opportunity to just go find those specialists when you need it based on the rules of the game that you figured out and what bets you want to make, and partner with really world-class specialist agencies to do that in a way that you might not need to hire for. And a mentor of mine, Ben Cockrell at Mainstay, taught me one of the best ways you can decide how to build that team is you can have an agency help you evaluate what channels before you hire full-time, because it's way easier to pivot. Like if you aren't sure if you can get enough out of paid to justify a full-time headcount, right? You can test that in an easier way by having agencies for some of it. And then you might realize, this actually does justify an agency and a full-time headcount or something like that. So there's ways to take medium bets on things that tap into specialists that you might not need to hire directly for.
Yeah, that's been an interesting thing coming out. I mean, we're in a recession now. I know some people wouldn't label it that or try to avoid calling it that, but what we thought as an agency was, oh crap, these companies are going to cut marketing budget and not want to work with contractors anymore. But it seems like the opposite, where they're saying, actually, we have to let go of full-time employees, but an agency or a contractor, we can just like hire and fire as needed. So we want to work with you to help build out this function to hedge our bets, essentially. And it sounds like that's what you're saying here, not just in the case of a recession, but when you're validating some channels, hire a contractor or an agency to test it out first.
Yep. I think it's important that you really believe in the agency, because you wouldn't want a ineffective agency to make you jaded on the channel. So like trust matters a lot if you're going to pursue this. And I don't think it's necessarily the play, but it's certainly a tool in the tool belt. Like there's no world where I could have hired a fleet of content experts to build organic, but you guys are doing that for us and it's been amazing. So that's a good example of like, you can access scale competency before you have it if you are working with really good agencies.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a discussion. You know how VCs, when they talk about a company, that has to be like, oh, I'm an investor. In this case, like you're a client. So disclaimer, Eric's a client. I wanted to get back to teams, right? You talked about hiring generalists, and that means, they're going to be doing a lot of different roles and different types of projects that they've probably never done before. How do you coach folks through those sort of situations?
Yes. I think, well, first I'll say, I think situational leadership is one of the best models that I personally think and try to implement, which is you manage to the skill, not the person. So there are people who are probably really good at something and they can be, and you can just delegate that and, you know, be a support mechanism if needed. And then that same person probably has skills where you need to be really directive with how to do it the first time. And I think some managers make the mistake of just thinking of a person as senior, but really it's this person is senior at certain things and they're junior at other things, and making sure that you're thinking through that as a manager. Second is building the culture that engenders people being open about that without feeling like it jeopardizes their career path. Because if someone feels like if they admit they need to build a skill would block their promotion, then they'll never proactively seek the counsel to coach them on it in the first place. So you know, that's a psychological safety is a pretty trendy term. I just think of it as like, you know, do you lead with humility and vulnerability? And is that accepted on your team as something that's expected for all of us to grow? It's kind of like a growth mindset, honestly.
Interesting. So you set the expectation like, hey, you're expected to learn new things. Like that's not a bad thing.
Yep. And some people are kind of have that name. Some people, like, especially if they come from a larger company where any sort of vulnerability was punished, it takes a while for them to adjust to that. That can be jarring. And another piece of it, I would say, is, you know, much like the Lego analogy, start small. If there's somebody they have to try something for the first time, you can de-risk it while also giving them space to fail and iterate on their own. Like one of the things that our team has that I think works really well is a retro mechanism where every 2 weeks we come together, we talk about what worked, what didn't, how to make it better. It's expected that you reward the insight to make it better. It's like a hot Eric take, but like one of the drawbacks of the scientific community is you're disproportionately rewarded for success, and failure is you're better off to not promote. And that just leads to a lot of waste. So, you know, in a business setting for marketing teams, right, anytime you can amplify, honestly, failures through the context of we reduced a known unknown, that's just the good of the team. And it also, and if you celebrate that as a leader, then all those people who are having trouble adopting that framework, you can kind of use that as a mechanism to show like, yes, we actually will reward people who show vulnerabilities.
Yeah. I think at HubSpot, we did these things called failure forums. And the goal is to avoid like success theater, where all you do is talk about the successes and then like discourage is talking about failures. Right. And you mentioned the scientific community. I mean, I don't know if you heard about this, but like decades of research that had showed amyloid beta plaques to cause Alzheimer's has been proven to be false. Yeah. But billions of dollars and companies built on this research are now like, I mean, they're still probably going to stay around, but it's a very extreme example of a culture where everyone felt like they had to just go with what was being said, which you can see happen in business too, where once you peel back the layers a little bit, it's like, wait a minute, this data is wrong. Like none of this is actually working, which is a nightmare I haven't been in before, but I've heard stories of.
If you're the person who would be building teams, that's very important to screen for executives when you're interviewing. Kind of when you're interviewing them back, you want to make sure that that same approach that we just talked about is something that they also celebrate.
Mm-hmm. What about something that I'm trying to get better at is, for us, I think we've developed the skill of being able to communicate to C-levels and VPs like at that executive level, quote, and figuring out how to coach that skill for individual contributors who like they want to progress in their career, but they continue to stay very deep in the weeds and have trouble speaking at a higher elevation. This is me asking selfishly, like, have you been coaching your team on that? And like, if so, how?
It's a good question. Well, the first one is to apply marketing principles, which is where is your audience at? So like a marketer by definition should be thinking about where is a user in their journey when I'm trying to reach them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The same is true for an internal presentation. Like, and if you start to think about those people as this is going to sound bad, but as personas, like there's an executive persona. What do they need to know? What do they care? What's important to them? What are they saying to their bosses? What are they worried about? What risks are there? How can what you're communicating empower them? It's all the same things you might think through for a campaign. So that could be one way. Another would be to provide a forum where they can hear the questions, right? Because sometimes that really makes it click for people. Like you think you're coming in, like you're going to talk about, some really cool report you built in Google Analytics. And then they ask a question like, so is that like a website visitor? And you're like, oh, cool. That doesn't happen. But like when you hear people ask questions, it helps calibrate pretty quickly, like any differences there. But I do think as a manager or a function leader, like setting the why your work fits into the big picture will help people understand that. And you can give them a language to use in either a retro forum or whatever, so that you can see that laddering up effect. And if you can talk about how it works as a system frequently in team meetings, then you can help people who are pretty far in the weeds start to understand, like, this is the value we're having by being this deep in the weeds.
Yeah. I like that a lot. Those are some notes for me to follow up on later. And last question about teams is, we've talked about like culture among a team, and I think people might define what a good team culture looks like, but I'd love to hear from you. How do you think about building culture with your team? Like, it sounds like some of the psychological safety is something you try to support. So what else do you do to help build that culture amongst your team?
Yeah, this is a hard one in the pandemic. I'll just say it seems like it's much more difficult when you're remote or partially remote. So definitely empathize with all of the managers who are trying to navigate this. I think some in-person time goes a really long way, even if it's not super often, just to like establish relationships. And then you can start to do some fun things like, some people, one member, of our team is a peer of mine. We have fancy breakfasts on Friday. That's our one-on-one. Like, you know what? We live close enough. We're both remote. Let's get fancy breakfast. And we'll just go to different places and cover a lot of stuff, So
that's
like
awesome.
Little things like that can inject fun. And another thing that, our CRO did, it got a painting commissioned of one of the employees for the office of them riding their cat. So you start to get these like fun, like personality trait things you can instill into the office environment, which are cool. But yeah, remote is difficult. Part of it is strong shared vision. Part of it is celebrating each other and having a format to do that. Part of it is who you hired in the first place to have what I would consider like culture add traits. And then tactically, going bowling. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really tough. I mean, HubSpot, it was, we were all in office. We go hang out, get a beer, get some coffee or whatever, go for a walk around the river. And now that it's fully remote, I'm like, how do we get to know each other? Because Zoom feels so transactional. And so what we started doing for our team, like we have weekly all hands and we do like updates and priorities, but we're also like, hey, give a shout out to someone on the team who's like was really helpful or you saw do something really cool. And like, it's really fun. It adds like that appreciation. It's not just talking about like, it's not just success theater. Like, oh, I did all this stuff. It's like, no, I appreciate this person because they helped me. And that's been really helpful. But it's tough when people are in different time zones too. Like, Glenn, he's in Bangkok and then we have team members in like India and across the US. So it's challenging to do the async culture building.
There's some pretty good Zoom games that we've been introducing at Order. Zoom games. Most recently, our sales manager did a game called Pasta or Impasta. And it was a zoomed up picture, and half of them were pasta and half of them were impastas. Like, it's silly, but it's fun if you can interject that into some of your meetings, things like that.
I thought you were going to go down the road of like Jackbox TV or something.
Oh, that was,
but that's too
like
mainstream.
That flamed out quickly. Yeah, those were fun for a minute, and then you you're on Zoom like 6 hours at work, and then your family wants to do that from like 8 to 10. You're like, I'm going to die. You can't.
Yeah, that was a tough part too. Like even when teams had those things, I didn't join because I was like, I want to go on a run, like away from my laptop, not sit on a Zoom. And so when I think about team building things, my team, I'm like, do I want to ask them to sit in front of Zoom and like have work fun, like force work fun? It doesn't seem enjoyable, but yeah, that's something I'll keep you posted if I find some new things to do.
just picturing everybody FaceTiming on a jog, team building, trying to hold your phone up.
Not yet. All right. So maybe wrapping up here, got a couple questions for you. What's one opinion you got about business that people would disagree with?
That's a good question. What's my business hot take?
I know you got plenty.
The first one is, I think pretty much every business has not hired enough analysts.
Okay. Say more about that.
It's just shout out number people and data people, but like there's not enough of them. And I feel like that, generally speaking, in today's world, you need quantitative capabilities to be effective in virtually any job. And I think that the ability to not just read data, but understand the data you need to make good decisions and proactively ask for it, or to be able to see like insight through charts, just the basics, like whatever your job is, like, can you have at least a baseline quant skill to improve what you're doing? And I really think that's true of any job. And then you need the serious data firepower to enable the team to do that in the background, whether that's like, connecting tables or building visualizations or anything like that. But generally speaking, I think people underinvest in that capability because models may not require it, but having it makes a big difference to avoid problems as you grow. So that's one hot. I don't know how hot a take that is, but it's a take. Maybe the commenters can rate that take on spiciness. Another take that I think most people in business would disagree with. Oh, here's one. Process is not always a good thing.
Yeah, that's
here's my. This is a spicy
take. Go for it. Tell me more about that.
Minimum viable process. The way you know a process is working is it accelerates. If you ask yourself, by doing this process, is my job easier or faster? And the answer is no, break it. Do something different or remove it entirely. Lots of people want things to be like in these clean, tight boxes, especially if they're like really strong operators, but that's not the right play for a lot of scenarios. So, any business where moving quickly is tantamount to like success or learning, like you need the minimum viable process to enable that to happen as quickly as possible. And maybe that's a stand-up and that's it. And maybe that's an Asana board or an Airtable board or whatever, if that's what works for you. And maybe it's different for each team member. If the goal is move quickly and you're in a scenario where you have to do that, sometimes peeling off some of those required things is better, so long as you've hired the right people. And I think that's the big part because, actually this is a big part of that whole Netflix book, No Rules, right? If you've hired well, you can kind of remove some of those constraints. But I think that's especially true in any company that needs to move quickly by necessity.
How do you break that mindset? I've been in meetings where it might be a group of people who are saying, yeah, we need this process. And so to be that one person saying, actually, this process is like slowing us down and actually making things more difficult. Like what's the culture shift that needs to happen, or like how have you pulled people out of that black hole of optimizing for process?
Yeah, I think that's the framing, exactly that. It's like you can optimize for two things. You can optimize to know what's happening, or you can optimize to doing the thing. Which is more important right now?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're optimized to doing the thing, but you need a minimum viable know what's happening, what is the process that you need for that? It might just be one person attends a stand-up with the person doing it. It might be a Slack. And there's all sorts of scenarios where this isn't a good idea. There's a ton of scenarios where it is. And I think that it should be a conscious decision, not an accident of what we did before. And like, there are some times when you really need to know at all times what's happening. And in those scenarios, you may make the conscious decision that we're okay with the cost of having that process optimized for knowing, right, at the expense of production. But in a lot of cases that you wouldn't. And I think people may not realize that that's the actual trade-off in some scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've seen cultures where it's like, hey, we have a new project. Great. Let's have a weekly sync on it, or like a daily sync. I'm like, wow. There are now weekly syncs for every single project that takes up 10 hours of my week. Like, what is this necessary? Yeah. And then people aren't even paying attention in the meetings, right? So I love that idea of the minimum viable process. All right. So what is the most impactful piece of advice you've been given?
Okay. I have a few. So the first one was very early career. And it was when I had just left. I don't know how many of your listeners are kind of like entry level or around then, but for those people, I was pretty bummed I didn't get into one of those canned rotational programs, which were a big deal back in the day. Like you get a cool big company rotational program. And I was speaking with somebody at the time. They're just like, just go make your own. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, just go get a job in each of the things you want to do. Like you can do that. And it doesn't have to be here. And I was like, oh,
mind blown.
Yeah, it blew my mind. Right. Because especially at the time, I was like really jazzed to be working. Liberty's a great company. You know, at the time it was kind of a labor shortage. So it was just a bad hiring market when we graduated. So like, you know, the concept that I could just go work in different capacities that ultimately served a career better. It didn't feel like I was restarting a career 4 times. It kind of changed it to like, no, I'm building 4 different skill sets and 4 different jobs so that I can get to the next thing that I want to do. Which
that's awesome.
That was really impactful. And I kind of did that. If you look at like analyst to process improvement coach to talent management team member to cross-sell, upsell marketing, it's like, that doesn't make sense at the time, but each move was on purpose, right? To build a skill set and get exposure to a new type of company and move industries. And yeah, it got me to where I am now, which I'm really happy with, just actually working on startups and helping them scale and find go-to-market fit. And then I would say the next most impactful piece of advice. Okay. So this one is something that I've been trying to get better at, because as my team has grown, I've had to shift from a player coach where I still had my hands in the weeds to just like an actual coach manager where like, you know, your success is dependent on others and your job is to enable, empower, unblock, and contextualize things for those people. Right. And this is going to sound really cliche, but you need to trust people to do it. And it's okay if they fail, so long as they're doing it to get better over time. And you need to manage to the person. So that vice shout out to Corey Beal, who's our CRO, right? Like that's gone well. Right. And that's what I try to do with each of my team members, which is, you know, what do they need right now? How do I best empower, contextualize? And if there's failure, so long as it's with guardrails and is predictable and is hypothesis driven, you can actually create an engine that will be successful. So
that's an awesome piece of advice.
Cool.
Where can people find you on the internet?
Oh yeah. I guess I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah. Eric D. Hann. And then you can check out Order, helping all sorts of businesses spend more efficiently.
Awesome. We'll make sure to link to those in the show notes. It was awesome having you on the show, Eric.
Thank you, David.
All right. See ya.
Thanks. Awesome being here.